One of the fascinating things about apologetics is that it's a field that always changes. There's always new information. So it's very different from dogmatics that way. Dogmatics doesn't change, apologetics does. And this morning, as I was getting ready to come over, thinking about speaking on natural law, it occurred to me that going back to the resurrection and going back to you saying to someone, did you know that there is overwhelming evidence that Jesus actually rose from the dead? And that you could say that accurately, truthfully, that we have 7 eyewitness accounts in the Scriptures, 5 of them directly eyewitness, 2 of them based on eyewitness accounts, of early church leaders, church scholars. Well, let's start with the biblical. Eyewitness accounts of people who say they saw the risen Jesus and were willing to die for what they said, and who exhibited transformed lives. 7. And imagine a court case where you've got 7 eyewitnesses. I mean, the case is yours. Slam dunk. In addition to the 7 eyewitnesses, we've got 7 church leaders, and they're all in your handouts, leaders, scholars, who attest to the fact that, yes, these documents were written by the eyewitnesses. They are written by the apostles who were filled with the Spirit and were eyewitnesses, and we have every reason to trust them. And all of a sudden it occurred to me, the number 7 has significance in the Scriptures. The earth and everything in it, the universe, was created in 7 days, including the day of rest. The apostles asked Jesus, how many times should we forgive our brothers? Is it 7? And Jesus says 70 times 7. And in the book of Revelation, the number 7 comes up quite a number of times. Well, we've got 7 eyewitness accounts in the New Testament, and we have 7 church scholars in the 2nd century that attest to their authenticity. Now, maybe that's just coincidence. At least it's an easy way to remember how many eyewitness accounts and church scholars we have. 7 of each. So anyway, that might be useful to you when you talk to other people about the evidence that the resurrection is true. Now, I want to add one more footnote before going on to natural law, and that is this, that it is very common for you to speak with people, or people will hint around at this in your presence, people who aren't sure if they are believers or not. And very often these individuals say, I know a believer is filled with the joy of the Holy Spirit, and I'm depressed. I know believers live a virtuous life, and my life is a mess. I noticed that got Ted. I noticed that got his attention. I mean, seriously, that's right. I mean, an awful lot of people say, I look at my life, and I know what the life of a Christian is supposed to be like. I just have serious doubts about whether I am a believer. And the answer to that is to suggest to people, don't look at your life to answer the question, am I a believer? Am I a believer? And don't look at how you feel to answer the question, am I a believer? Look to the cross, okay? Look to the cross and the resurrection. And there's something about I'm going to say public, but when I say public, that also includes just yourself and one other person. There's something about a public confession of faith, and we often talk about confession of sin, but there's such a thing as confession of faith too. And I will ask that person this. I will say, Jesus the Christ died on the cross for you and was risen again, and the resurrection is God's statement to you, your sins are forgiven. Do you believe that? And the person that says yes, unless they're lying, which people are not likely to lie on this, the person that says yes is in the kingdom. but point them to the cross and the resurrection. Okay? Now, I want to comment quickly on the converse of that. And that is this, that the skeptics, New Testament scholars who are skeptics, atheists, agnostics, whatever, will admit that, yes, it was the eyewitnesses of Jesus who said he had risen. And they obviously were convinced of that because they were willing to die for it. It was the eyewitnesses who said he had risen. They were convinced of it, that he had risen. But they will stop just short of saying he is risen. That's the Rubicon. Okay? That's the Rubicon that they can't cross without entering the kingdom. And they sense that. They sense that. To cross that Rubicon is also to say Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ of God, the Lamb of God who came to save me. Because you're saying all that when you say he is risen. It's essentially the same as Jesus asks his disciples, including Peter, who do people say that I am? And they say, John the Baptist, the prophet, reincarnate, blah, blah, blah. Well, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus replies, essentially, yes, that is correct. But flesh and blood did not show this to you, Peter, but my Father, which is in heaven. It is only by the power of God, that a person can honestly say, you are the Christ, the Son of the living. And so there is something about public confession, or even confession to yourself, that makes it clear either you are stopping just short of the kingdom or you have entered the kingdom. So anyway, I thought I should add that footnote because I frequently get into conversations, with people or about people who say, I don't know if I'm a believer or not. Point them to the cross, and that tells the story. Okay. And of course, that's the purpose of apologetics, and that's the purpose of my life, to point people to the cross. Today we're going to take up the topic of natural law, and let me first give a definition. Natural law is the inborn knowledge of God's moral law. Period. The inborn knowledge of God's moral law. Just to illustrate that a little bit, one of the places I ran into loggerheads with the Theological Review at Concordia was on my statement that God's moral law, the natural law, is part of our genetic code. He said, hey, we've always said it's written on the heart. And now you want to locate the moral law in the genetic code. And I read that, and what am I going to say now? Because written in the heart obviously is metaphorical language. I mean, it's written on the essence of who we are. That's what we mean by written in the heart. And I frankly think it's a little more accurate to say it's part of the knowledge of our DNA, because that's not figurative. Now I'm going to the literal. So we finally got past that loggerhead. But I'm going to say, frankly, it's in our DNA. Let me also say this, that in my own study of natural law, the breakthrough for me was when I understood that the content of the moral law is exactly the same as natural law as compared to the Ten Commandments and revealed law. The content is one and the same. For me, that's what opened the door. Bingo, now I can see how it all fits. Now, in the revealed law, it's spelled out in a lot more detail, but the content is the same. So when we talk about revealed law versus natural law, all we're talking about is the question, how do we come to know what it is? It's not the content we're talking about, it's how we get there, how we learn it. So that's the beginning position. In our time, a number of theologians have lamented the lack of teaching and study on natural law. Many. And many theologians have said we have lost our way by ignoring natural law. And I'm one of those. I mean, I'm totally sympathetic to that. Especially in our day of relative morality, we have lost our way. And Jared knows I haven't done this in this class yet, and maybe I will and maybe I won't, but I often, early in my time with the class, will ask the question, how many of you believe that morality is universal and absolute? And Jared, you better raise your hand when I ask it, when I ask it this time. But Christian college, I'll tell you, not many students will answer yes to that. How many of you think what's right and wrong is what's right and wrong for you? Okay, I mean, there we go. I mean, that's what they say. That's what they've been indoctrinated with. And I just think that reality, and by the way, I would invite you to test that with any group that's where you have a chance. Jack's going to do it with his political group. I can see this coming. How many of you think what's right and wrong is what's right and wrong for you? And 90% of Republicans raise their hand, and Jack has got to go, my friends, I thought. So anyway, the ignorance of the moral code, how it works, what it is profound. So let's start with that. But what I want to do this morning is focus our attention primarily on the description of natural law in Romans chapter 2. And I will say frankly, there is no better brief description of natural law than Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. And so that's going to be our starting point. If this was a sermon, I would call it our text, but it's not a sermon, so we'll call it our jumping off point. But this is what we're going to deal with.
What's the verse again?
Chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. Yeah, it's just, I make it too easy for you, I know that. But indeed, when Gentiles, in this case meaning non-Jews, non-believers, who do not have the law, do by nature things required in the law, by the law, they are a law for themselves even though they do not have the law. Now you see, I mean, Paul is speaking here in paradoxes, and I just love that. I mean, I kind of groove on that kind of language. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. I would translate that DNA, but okay. Their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. Yes, Chris.
That's obviously where we get our language about law on the heart.
Yes.
But do you know enough about the language there to say whether Paul was speaking towards the metaphorical heart or really the heart meaning the core of the human being?
No, I do not. But we've got a couple language scholars here in the front row. I think they can probably answer that question if Paul's language suggests metaphorical heart or physical heart. So we'll ask Caleb to give us a report before we adjourn here. Okay? It's really nice to have language scholars right to my left and say, Caleb, go for it. Okay, so we'll leave that question on the table as a question for now, Chris, and we'll see what we can do. Just as another example of our contemporary ignorance of what natural law is, when Michelle Bachmann was in the state Senate, and I'm going to go back probably 12 years, maybe, I'm not sure just how long, we had on the floor a bill that spelled out what are called the Minnesota Education Standards. And this is a list, if you will, of what students would have to know before they could graduate from high school. And it's broken down by different grade levels and so on. But anyway, that's on the floor. Senator Michelle Bachmann adds an amendment, or moves an amendment. The amendment is to add an understanding of natural law to the graduation requirements. The chair of the Senate Education Committee, Senator Steve Kelly, responded by saying, Senator Bachman, we do not know what natural law is, quote unquote. I mean, what an admission from the chair of the Senate Education Department. We do not know what natural law is. I suspect he was telling the truth. But what he was implying is we can't add an education standard of something we don't understand. Now, if he had read the Declaration of Independence, maybe he never did, he would have read paragraph 1. By the way, I always tell people, if you're going to memorize the Declaration of Independence, don't start with paragraph 2, start with paragraph 1. That's where it begins. Because paragraph 1 stipulates the last phrase that we owe our freedom, or we base our freedom on the laws of nature and nature's God. What is that? It's natural law. The founders of our country understood natural law, and they said, because natural law, we have a right to be free. And I want to say that is absolutely true. And anybody that has any involvement in government should understand that. It is because of natural law that we have a right to be free. And why is it that it's wrong to murder somebody? It's because people have a right to live. All our rights are the opposite side of the coin of right and wrong. Why is it wrong to steal somebody's property? It's because they have a right to have property. And right down the line. Okay, so the lack of understanding is absolutely profound. And on top of that, the current worldviews, without exception, deny natural law. I mean, let's start with humanism, Humanist Manifesto, let's say number 277. Morality is self-chosen. Really? What that means, what's right for you is right. Freudianism denies natural law. Behaviorism denies natural law. Materialism obviously denies natural law. Postmodernism denies everything, including natural law. So it's not surprising that our students who have been schooled in all these worldview things, of course they think that there is no universal moral code. Now, going back to what Paul says in Romans, there are at least 6 important truths in those 2 verses. And so I'm going to describe natural law in terms of what Paul says, and all I'm doing is pulling out from what he says 6 very important truths. The first one we've already talked about, and it's the most obvious, and that is that natural law is part of the genetic code. It is instinctive, we could say. And I like to use the analogy because my wife and I are bird watchers. I like to use the analogy of the nest of a Baltimore Oriole. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with that nest. It's a pouch that is intricately woven. And you can look at one and ask, now did they start at the top and do it top down? Obviously they did. And how did they do that? It's always way out in the far recesses of some very slender branches, so it's almost impossible for a predator to get there. It always has at least 3 attachment points, and then it's woven. And if you have orioles where you live, and if you want to find them, just put a few pieces of orange string out in the yard, and I guarantee, ideally about a foot long, I guarantee the orioles will pick up that orange string, and they will weave it into their nest. Now, how does an oriole know how to make that nest? They didn't observe it. I mean, the eggs hadn't even been laid yet. They didn't observe it. How do they have that marvelous engineering skill to do that? Obviously, it's instinctive. It's in their genetic code. And so if the King of Kings, the creator of all things, can put the knowledge of how to build that nest into the brain of a bird, surely he can put the knowledge of right and wrong into the brains of human beings, into the genetic code. So anyway, that's where we begin. Natural law is instinctive. That means principle 2. that natural law is singular and universal. And let me start with the singular, because when Paul here is talking about the law, it's always singular. It's not laws, there's one law. And as I mentioned, that means that the moral code in the Ten Commandments and in natural law are one and the same. But it is singular. That means we should never use the language of quote-unquote Christian morality. Nor should we ever use the language of quote-unquote Judeo-Christian morality, because it suggests very strongly that Christian people have a different moral code than other people, and that is false. And sad to say, it suggests the postmodern worldview, because to the postmodernists, what's right and true for one group is true for that group only, and another group sees things differently. That's postmodernism. So anyway, I just say to everyone I can, don't give fuel to the hard left by talking about Christian morality. Now, can you imagine me saying this to legislators? I mean, they've talked about Christian morality their whole political career. And you're telling me I can't use that language? Yep, I'm telling you, you can't use that language, because right and wrong is singular. And if you murder somebody, I don't care if you're from the United States or South Africa, and I don't care if you're Muslim, Buddhist, or Christian. It is wrong regardless of your nation or religion, socioeconomic status, you name it. Okay? It is singular. And to be singular means it's also universal. The same for Americans, as South Africans, as Koreans, and even Norwegians. And I know that's tough, but even the same. Okay? So that's part of it. So Jesus is asked in John 13, 34, and 35, and he's asked once or twice, well, what new moral command do you give us? And at this point he says, well, a new commandment I do give you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Now, in what sense was that new? In what sense was that new? Was this actually a new addition to the moral law? It wasn't, was it? It was probably new to them. You know, the Jews had all kinds of intricate laws in terms of who you had to befriend and who you didn't. And by the way, that's a big reason why in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, the priest and the Levite go to the side of the road. Because, see, they were required to help somebody if they were Jewish. But if they were Samaritan, they could look the other way. They didn't want to get close enough to find out if they had to help them. So they stayed on the other side, so they didn't know, and so ignorance was bliss to them. Okay, singular, universal, there is no, and Jesus did not come to add anything to the moral law. He came to fulfill it, not to add to it. All right, so we're all clear on that. Principle number 3. The moral code, natural law, consists of both tables of the law. Our relationship to God and our relationship to one another. And the two are inextricably connected. Inextricably connected. If there is a God, obviously we owe allegiance to him. And if there's a God, he has expectations for us. And if there's a moral code, there must be a God. And I mentioned before how Bertrand Russell, for instance, was deeply troubled because his atheism couldn't lead him to a position where there was a moral code. And he never, to the best of my knowledge, he never solved that. Principle 4. Paul says they show the evidence That is, natural law is observable. Now I get interested. Natural law is observable, and it is. And I gave you before the example of this pastor at the Planned Parenthood booth who wanted to deny natural law, and yet quickly, when I asked him about killing somebody, he said that would be terrible. And so he revealed the evidence of the natural law written in his genetic code. Principle 5, if it is observable, then it can be studied scientifically. Now, I have mentioned you before, I'm kind of a strange duck in the field of everything, but I would challenge you to find any essay on natural law any place that makes that obvious observation. And you will not find it. If natural law is observable, albeit indirectly, then it could be studied scientifically. And thankfully, there was, now deceased, a brilliant psychologist at Harvard University who undertook to study the moral code. And he actually did the bulk of his study when he was in grad school at the University of Chicago. His name is Lawrence Kohlberg, Kohlberg. And in the field of psychology, I know this has been true in the past, probably still true today, he is considered the giant of research and knowledge regarding the moral code, and properly so. So he went through his undergraduate study in 19 months, and then spent 9 years on his PhD. And he says, just to show you can't predict academic success. Well, the reason he spent all that time is because of what he discovered. And based on his doctoral dissertation, he was immediately offered a full professorship at Harvard. I tell you, my graduate work was never that successful. So he revolutionized the field in social psychology dealing with moral values. He revolutionized it. So anyway, Lawrence Kohlberg, in studying natural law, confronted people. He did the bulk of his study by confronting people with dilemmas, moral dilemmas, and he took most of these dilemmas from cases of casuistry in the Christian church. He's not a believer, but that's where he found most of his dilemmas. And I just want to say that to Kohlberg, the way the person answered the dilemma was not at issue. What was at issue was what principle or standard did a person use as a basis of answering the dilemma. That's the issue. So I want to explain to you his most famous dilemma. I don't think he got this one out of casuistry, but his most famous dilemma is referred to as the famous Heinz dilemma, spelled just like Heinz ketchup. Okay, the famous Heinz dilemma. And you need to know the famous Heinz dilemma. Here's the parable. A couple lived in a country in Europe, and the wife was dying of cancer. The druggist in that town had discovered a cure for cancer, a miracle cure, which he was selling for $2,000 a pop. But the thing was miraculous. I mean, you take this drug and you're cured. And so Heinz went to the druggist to buy the drug to save his wife. And the druggist said to Heinz, well, I'd love to sell it to you. Price is $2,000. Heinz replied, I don't have $2,000. I've got $1,200. Well, the price is $2,000. Well, could I pay the rest later? No, $2,000 up front. I don't give credit. So Heinz went to his neighbor's friend's bank or whatever to see if he could raise the $2,000. Couldn't raise it. His wife is dying. Tried to find the money. Couldn't find it. Finally at night, broke into the store, stole the drug, gave it to his wife. His wife was healed. Question. Should Heinz have done that? Question. And I'm not going to take the next half hour for us to debate that question, which we easily could do. But the interesting thing is people, and they might have to be pressed, will say yes or no. And then Kohlberg asks, why? And that's what Kohlberg is interested in, because you can't answer that question without appealing to some moral value. All right? Now, I'm going to just give you a hypothetical answer just to get this started, just to illustrate that. Person X, and I don't want to embarrass anybody here, although I would embarrass Ted if I had a chance. Ted's pretty sophisticated. I don't worry about him. But I don't want to embarrass anybody here. Jared, get ready, because in class I will embarrass your classmates. So get ready. Be prepared. But let's say John Doe says, well, he should have stolen the drug because, my stars, if his wife died, well, who would cook for him then? Do you think people actually answer that way? They do. They do. So, like I say, Kohlberg is interested in the way people defend their answer. He doesn't care whether they say yes or no. But what standard do you appeal to? And what Kohlberg found, among other things, and for us this is the most important, is that it doesn't matter what country you are going to and asking the dilemmas, and it doesn't matter if they're Jewish, Buddhist, pantheist, or Christian. They answer it the same way. It's the same in every nation, in every nationality, in every religion. According to Kohlberg, they answer it the same way. So Kohlberg says that the notion that morality is situational and relative is false. I like somebody that calls a spade a spade. The research demonstrates that relative morality is false, and that the moral code is exactly the same in every country, in every nation, in every people group. And other people have repeated his experiments and come up with the same results. This might be the best established truth in the social sciences. It's hard to find genuine truth in the social sciences. It's tough. This could well be it because it's so well established. Kohlberg then says that actually moral sophistication develops as a child grows. And that's another one of his findings that is duplicated again and again and again. So let's go to the development of moral understanding, and then we're going to make a bunch of applications. So according to Kohlberg, when you're dealing with a very young child, a child that is old enough to speak, let's say maybe 18 months. A lot of kids can speak pretty well at 18 months. Child goes to the cookie jar he's not supposed to be in, gets the cookie, you catch him with the cookie half eaten. Johnny, why did you do that? I was hungry. All right? According to Lawrence Kohlberg, that is a combination of moral levels 1 and 2. Moral level number 1 is avoid pain. If you've got a stomach ache because you're hungry, you get the cookie. All right? Moral level number 2, which is kind of the opposite side of the coin. It's hard to distinguish between 1 and 2 because they're so close to being the same. Number 2 is meet your needs. This cookie satisfies my hunger. I think all of us basically said that to the cooks this morning. You have satisfied our hunger. Now, we weren't intending to speak in a moral sense, but the kid caught in the cookie jar, you've got a moral situation. Okay, so that's moral levels 1 and 2. Now, sadly, according to Kohlberg's research, some people never get past that. Some people never get past moral levels 1 and 2. And I want to tell you, 2 days ago, I was talking to a mother of a severely handicapped child. And this was an adult child, and I had been talking about the same topic. There's an adult child, severely handicapped, who is living with his parents. And she said, this child always operates on the basis of avoiding pain or meeting his needs. And there's nothing we can do to get him past that. And what you have done is you have allowed me to understand why. he can't get past that. Okay? She was in tears when she said that. Now I understand. Kohlberg found that if you go into a prison and ask people, why are they there? They're not going to say, well, I broke the law. They're not going to say what I did was wrong. They're going to say, Bugsy ratted on me. Okay? That, you know what, and I'm not going to repeat the language. He was supposed to keep his mouth shut, and he didn't, and he ratted on me, and that's why I'm here. Okay? Most prisoners are at moral levels 1 and 2. I'm in the Minnesota legislature. I'm sitting across the table from the Minnesota Commissioner of Corrections, and I'm not going to mention his name just out of privacy concerns. So, you know me, I mean, I love putting people in the spot, and I just love talking about things that are important. So I asked him this question. I said, in the different corrective or therapeutic counseling and so on you do with the prisoners in the Minnesota State Prison System, have you found that any particular approach to corrections in your counseling works better than others? And his response was, we don't evaluate our counseling. I mean, what do you say? What do you say? You don't evaluate whether it works. No, it's not in the budget. Well, why don't you put it in the budget? Well, it never occurred to me. Okay. Here's the problem. Because I've read a fair amount on attempts to re-educate prisoners, you know what? It's based on higher moral levels than 1 and 2. And it's good to try to raise people to higher levels, but you also have to recognize where they are, and you have to talk to them in language they understand. At least you have to start there. I mean, did I say that the ignorance of moral law in our country is astounding? In the Western world is astounding? Yeah, and I mean, we do all kinds of stupid things as a consequence. Moral level number 3. And what Kohlberg does is he traces, as kids get older, how they are more likely to go up the moral scale. And typically they do, not always, but typically they do. Moral level number 3 is conformity, or simply, what would people think? So again, I'm at a different banquet of very professional people. I'm sitting right across the table from a very attractive blonde lady who is the wife of a very important man. And you know me, I mean, I like to talk to people, and I like to find out where they're coming from, and I talk. And so I was explaining to her something that I had, learned and so on. I'm just trying to share some things. And it had implications for things we should do, and she looked me right in the eye and said, yeah, but what would people think? And I'm looking at her, and in my mind, I'm saying, Lawrence Kohlberg, level 3. And that is honestly, that is exactly what happened. Exactly what happened. She couldn't buy what I was saying because of that principle, what should I say? That level of reasoning. To her, this was it. What would people think? Are there a lot of people out there? Yeah. One of the problems in dealing with teenagers, okay? I mean, to a lot of teenagers, most teenagers, the highest moral level is what would people think. And you as a parent are trying to talk to them in a higher level of moral reasoning, and your thought patterns are going like this. They're not connecting. Okay? Yes, go ahead, Ron.
Peer pressure, elementary, that's what that is. Peer pressure?
Well, yeah, sure. That's the moral level 3. Yep. By the way, I've seen studies of things like you have a clique of a half a dozen teenage girls. Another one joins them. The first half a dozen are all smokers. What do you think is going to happen to the girl that joins? I mean, she'll be a smoker in 7 days. And bet your money on it. Yeah, peer pressure. What would people think? I'm going to fit in. So, what's that, Ted? Social networking, yeah. Okay, that's moral level number 3. Moral level number 4 is law and order. What does the law say? What does the law say? What does the authority say? I think I mentioned to you that Nabil Qureshi, the Muslim, the biggest hurdle, he said, he had to overcome in converting from Islam to Christianity was to realize that what the authorities said was not the highest standard. And he had to go to what the scriptures said instead. But the imams, and in Islam, people are indoctrinated incessantly. What the authority says is it. You obey. And when you go in the army, and I'm not critical, I'm just saying this is practical here. What the sergeant says, you don't think, right? You don't question. You go. And I'm just saying in the army, that's practical. In religion, that's bad. And Jared can testify to the fact that I tell my class, don't you go out and defend anything on the basis of Quist says. Professor Quist says, You give them the evidence, okay? There's nothing that we do is authority-based other than scriptures are the authority and the evidence, used properly. Kohlberg makes a mistake here. He says the 10 Commandments are level 4. He never read Luther. Look at the way Luther writes his explanation to the commandments. Look at the way he writes his explanation. Thou shalt not steal. We shall not take our neighbor's property or life, or property, or means of making living, but we will help him, okay? We will help him maintain and protect, and so on. That's the way, and so the 10 Commandments superficially are level 4. In reality, they're the higher level, the highest level. And we're going to see evidence of that in a moment. Many of the moral dilemmas are level 4 versus level 6, which we haven't gotten to yet. Now, I don't know for sure if I'm going to take up one of the dialogues between Jesus and his enemies or not. Yeah, I probably will. But the dialogues between Jesus and his enemies consistently are his enemies come to him reasoning on level 4, and he answers in level 6. And his enemies, I know he's got us, but I can't figure out why. They didn't understand, but Jesus did. Now, let me clarify as I'm saying this. The 6 levels of moral reasoning, according to Kohlberg, are not what I call the truth. I think they're terribly useful. They are what I would call a paradigm. Are they well established scientifically? Yes, they are. Or I would call them a construct. They're extremely useful, but don't get the impression that I'm saying these are true. They're short of that. Does that make sense to you? They're useful. And I would say this is true of everything in the field of psychology, including social psychology. Now, the universality of the moral code, that's so well established. I'm willing to take that from theory and paradigm to truth. But the 6 stages, these are good judgments. I think it's terribly useful. But it's not scripture. And just as an example, it's probably more clear. Sigmund Freud, id, ego, and superego. I talk to people all the time that deal with these or talk about these things as though they're true. These things aren't questions of truth. These are constructs that are useful. And they fall short of being a really tight, defensible view of the world. Okay, stage 5, social contract. A social contract is an agreed upon system of moral standards. Our Constitution is a social contract. If a dorm council in the college puts together a set of rules, that's a social contract. I just heard Alex say, and I'm going to interpret a little bit here, Alex. We all agree that we're going to clean our rooms. If it's something we agree upon as a group, that's a social contract. Yeah, so it's very, very common. Now, for you people interested in government, the Constitution is a social contract but it's based on absolute principles, level 6. That's just basic government. Are you going to hear that from anybody else? No, but that's just the way it works. All I'm doing is connecting the dots. Constitution is level 5. Declaration of Independence is level 6. Level 5 based on level 6. That is why our Constitution is the longest lasting serving Constitution of any major country in the world. That's why, because it's right on the basics. Okay, level 6. Universal principles. Universal principles of equality, meaning the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Immanuel Kant stated it this way: do as you would be done by. Golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Justice. Justice. Everybody has equal rights before God and before the law. The punishment fits the crime. You heard me talk yesterday about the scales of justice. They're the universal symbol. Justice is part of level 6, universal principles. Life is more important than property. One of the dilemmas that gets at that is this one. You're driving down the highway, you come to the top of the hill, and all of a sudden, boom, here is the Mona Lisa. You have to let your imagination run wild, okay? Here's the Mona Lisa right in the middle of the right lane, no cars coming. Here is a child right in the middle of the left lane. You don't have time to go in the ditch. Which one do you hit? And God willing, you're going to say, I'm going to hit Mona Lisa rather than the child. That human life is more important than property. Another of the common dilemmas is this. You're on the beach, you're a good swimmer. Your Labrador got out too far and is drowning. But out here is somebody you don't know who's drowning. You've got same time to save one. Which one will it be? You would be amazed at how many people say, I would save my dog. Okay. If they're moral level 1 and 2, and maybe 3, they're going to save the dog rather than the person. Universal principles of justice. Human life is worth more than the life of an animal. Not to Peter Singer at Princeton, who says that if you favor human life over others, you're a speciesist.
Oh my God.
Yeah? Yeah? Probably the best known moral philosopher of our time. I heard him speak at Mankato about 10 years ago, and lots of people in wheelchairs came and protested. Because he says if you're in a wheelchair, you've got less of a right to live than a healthy dog. Peter Singer, than a healthy dog. Peter Singer. Okay? So they came in wheelchairs and protested. Yeah. Yeah, he says, if you can kill a child before it's born, why can't you kill it, after it's born? I mean, you can't argue with the logic. And sometimes you don't find that it's handicapped till after it's born, and that child has less of a right to live than a healthy puppy. Peter Singer. That's where you get when you deny natural law. And yet, I'm sure if I had access to him, and I did once, but I, didn't get as far as I would have liked to. He didn't like my questions. With the right moral dilemma, I think you could get him just like Richard Dawkins and so on. So, level 6, universal principles. Now, we're going to apply this to Scripture. Matthew 22:35-40. Let's read that. Then one of them, a lawyer. Lawyer is not a good translation. This is an expert in the Mosaic law. And the expert in the law, Greek says expert in the law, translators say lawyer. Problem is, it's not civil law, it's moral law, Mosaic law and prophets. He's not a lawyer. Expert in the Mosaic law, asked him a question, testing him. So he's just trying to get Jesus to say something that they can use against him. Saying, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus said to him, now notice he doesn't quote the 10 Commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and prophets. Wow. Clearly, level 6. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, notice he says, on these hang all the law and prophets. What he's saying is that the Ten Commandments are an application of universal principles level 6. All right? Teach that in your churches. Teach that in your classes. The Ten Commandments are an application of level 6. And the application is extremely important because people will rationalize their behavior, and the specific commandments make it a lot tougher to rationalize evil. I mean, Hitler presumably, I don't know if it's true, I don't know what he thought, but Hitler presumably thought he was doing a good thing by culling the herd, getting rid of the deplorables. He used a little different language, but the same idea. And, you know, he told his generals to impregnate as many Norwegian women as they could. You aware of that? These are called Hitler's children. Why? Because he said the Norwegians are the closest thing to the master race. At least he was right on something. Do I dare? I retract that. I apologize. Honestly, that was Hitler's thinking. I mean, he was just doing what any good herdsman would do. That's the way he looked at it. By the way, Darwin said the more advanced races are of necessity going to have to eliminate the less advanced races. That's what he said. And so all Hitler was doing what Darwin said. There is a straight line in the thought process from Darwin to Hitler. And by the way, Hitler wasn't the only racist of his time. I mean, the intelligentsia was generally racist, including in our country. So don't think ideas don't have consequences. But the important thing here I called your attention is Jesus understood clearly what Kohlberg is saying, because he said universal principles, and he said on these universal principles hang all the law and commandments. Paul says the same thing, almost exactly the same words. So they understood that the commandments are applications of the universal moral code. Yes, go ahead, Ron.
So we think about the covenant that God established with Israel.
Right.
Does that fit into stage 5 or stage 6?
Stage 6. Stage 6. Let's see. Let's go to the bottom of that page to Leviticus 19:18. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Same universal moral code. And so the Ten Commandments, properly understood, are applications of level 6. Now, I'm not talking about civil law. I'm not talking about the ceremonial law. Those are special. But in terms of the moral code, yeah, they're level 6. Properly understood. And by the way, you know, another expert in the law comes and asks Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he says, what have you been taught? And he says, love the Lord your God with all their heart, soul, and mind. And there's one more category in there, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says you've answered correctly. And so this expert in the Mosaic law understood that level 6 morality was really what it was all about. And Jesus said, you've answered correctly. But then he asked, but who is my neighbor? Trying to make himself look good because he's looked like a fool. And then Jesus tells him the story. Ted.
How does Kohlberg, my recollection from school is a little bit dimmed by time, how does Kohlberg line up with Maslow?
Well, Maslow is also has a theoretical his whole system is theoretical constructs. And when he talks about the self-actualizing person, he is talking about the person who understands love your neighbor as yourself. So there's a very tight correspondence to that degree. Of course, Maslow doesn't have all the detail, but theoretically, Maslow understood. And a lot of sophisticated thinkers have understood that the highest moral code is justice and the golden rule, besides Maslow. But it's interesting to see the correspondence. from some of these great minds. Because Maslow was a great mind, even though there's much he didn't understand. I mean, there's a lot Kohlberg didn't understand either.
He's talking more from a sense of, if I remember right, out of how do we meet our needs,
Right, right.
but they seem to, as you're reading this, they seem to line up.
Yes, to a large degree, that's correct. Now, you try to fit Freud or Skinner in this, and I mean, they're kind of off. And let me just say this: they're off on another different page. Now, let me also quote the Apostle Paul in his summary of the moral code. So it's the same as Jesus. He says, "For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, love your neighbor as yourself." So you've got it in Leviticus on one side, you've got it in Paul on the other side, you've got Jesus in the middle saying exactly the same thing. So, so many of the dialogues between Jesus and his enemies fit this paradigm. His enemies come to him with level 4, and Jesus answers with level 6. Is it right to heal on the Sabbath? And Jesus' enemies had all these intricate rules that are applications. You won't find them in the Ten Commandments that you can't heal on the Sabbath. But, they had this whole legalistic system of what you could do and what you couldn't do, and according to them, you couldn't heal on the Sabbath. And Jesus then says to them, if you had an ox or an ass that fell into a pit, you would pull it out on the Sabbath, pointing out their inconsistency. And then he says, isn't a human being worth more than your ox or your ass? Level 6. They come to him with level 4, their man-made moral rules. He answers level 6, the needs of a human being. And I will just say that when these kinds of moral questions are highlighted by a dialogue between Jesus and his enemies, they always come with level 4, and he always answers at level 6. And that's one of the very fascinating things. I mean, this is the master teacher at work. Okay, let me make a couple of, let's read one of these. Let's read one of these, Matthew 12. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? He said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, you will take hold of it. Will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Clearly, level 6. Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Okay? The law of love trumps your silly, legalistic, man-made rules. Then he said to them, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound did the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill him. They don't understand how they've just been bested in debate. So what's their answer? We're going to kill this guy. Now, let's take the application for Martin Luther, and I'll make a couple applications. And I'm just going to read here what Luther says, and that's on the top of page 4. Quote, this quote-unquote Martin Luther on his section on temporal authority. This story is told of Duke Charles of Burgundy. A certain nobleman took an enemy prisoner. The prisoner's wife came to ransom her husband. The nobleman promised to give back the husband on condition that she would lie with him. The woman was virtuous, yet wished to set her husband free. So she goes and asks her husband whether she should do this thing in order to set him free. The husband wished to be set free, and dare I say, moral level numbers 1 and 2. And I don't want to be too harsh on him, because I have a hunch that you, like me, if you're driving too fast, I have a hunch you slow down when you see the patrolman. Confession's good for the soul. I confess. Kohlberg says if you're operating at level 6, you are capable of operating at any lower level too. I think that's pretty obvious. Okay, so I don't want to be too hard on him because I don't know if I would have done any better. So, confession time. After the nobleman had had lain with his wife, he had the husband beheaded the next day and gave him to her as a corpse. She laid the whole case before Duke Charles. He summoned the nobleman and commanded him to marry the woman. She's going to get his property. When the wedding day was over, he had the nobleman beheaded and gave the woman possession of his property and restored her to honor. I don't think that's complete. Thus he punished the crime in a princely way. Observe, no pope, no jurist, no law book could have given him such a decision. It sprang from untrammeled reason. Let me just insert here. The founders of our country believed that civil law must be based on the moral law, on the universal moral code. And that is the correct way to approach civil law. Okay? And this notion you can't legislate morality. I mean, we legislate morality all the time. The only question is, are we doing it right and basing it on the universal moral code or something else? All right. No pope, no jurist, no law book could have given him such a decision. It sprang from untrammeled reason. Now, in this case, when Luther's talking about reason, he's talking about natural law. It's clear. You know,
Untrembled.
just untrammeled. It's just unadulterated, just clear reason. Okay. He says, so excellent that everyone must approve of it and find the justice of it written in his own heart. So he's saying this is moral law, or this is natural law, written on his own heart. St. Augustine relates a similar story in the Lord's Sermon on the Mount. Therefore, we should keep written laws subject to reason, and here by that he means natural law, from which they originally welled forth as from the spring of justice. And Luther understood this just, right on the money. And justice is part of natural law. I think it's quite an example of how Luther said that justice trumps the authority of some puny little duke. Let me make a couple of applications. Number one, some years ago, this goes back a while now, there was an approach to child rearing called parent effectiveness training. And I cut my teeth as a young man criticizing a school board that was offering adult education that was parent effectiveness training. Parent effectiveness training said you never criticize a child because you'll hurt his self-image. And you certainly never spank a child because you'll destroy his self-image. So what you do is you say things like this. Let's say you've got a kid, let's say you've got a piano in your kitchen, which we do. Let's say a 3-year-old child goes and starts pounding away on the keys, bang, bang, bang. And if that's not enough, he takes out a hammer, and you know this is not going to end well. What do? You say, well, Daddy doesn't like it when you hit the keys with a hammer. Parent effectiveness training. You think that's going to work very well? One of the basic flaws is the notion that the child can reason on a high level of morality. Child can't reason that way. Johnny, you quit that or I'm going to tan your behind. Now I understand. Okay. I will tell you, a 3-year-old understands pain much better than the law of love. And that's why this program, was such an abysmal failure. And it's one of the reasons there's so many kids in colleges now that have no discipline because they were raised in this nonsense. I was in the home of a clergyman once who tried to discipline his son this way, and I am in shock. I personally got into a debate in the newspaper with the St. Peter School Board because they were teaching parent effectiveness training, PET, in their community education, and I said, this is humanism which is hostile to Christianity. You can't do it. It violates Amendment 1. And there was a liberal clergyman in town that responded. He said, what do you mean? Yeah, it's humanism, but humanism and Christianity are totally compatible. That's what I call throw me a softball. So I wrote back, and of course, local papers love controversy because they sell papers. I mean, they love this. So I wrote 2 columns. Here are the basic beliefs of humanism. These are the basic beliefs of Christianity. You want to tell me that these are, that these are harmonious? That was the end of the program. School board didn't care, but they didn't want controversy out. So another application. According to Lawrence Kohlberg, 2/3 of the population never gets above level 4. Just keep in mind that's what you're dealing with. 2/3 never gets above level 4. So how do you talk to them? You know, how do you talk to them? And that is a mega challenge. Just let me say one more thing. I'll get your question, William. This is why, after the Supreme Court made its Roe versus Wade decision, mandating abortion on demand in every one of the 50 states, on the public opinion polls, acceptance of legalized abortion went from something like 28% to 60%, boom, just like that. Why? Because to most people, the authority dictates what's right and what's wrong. If the Supreme Court says it's right, then it's right. And so when I was in the legislature, one of the points I consistently made on various bills was that a law is not only designed to curb bad behavior, it's also designed to tell the public what's right and what's wrong. And that was always an interesting debate. But, you know, people came to accept that because, yeah, I mean, duh. But that's one of the important applications. It's also why, what should I say, if you're going to have rules of a dorm council, you know, you have to go past love your neighbor as yourself. you have to say, no women in the boys' rooms after whatever. I mean, you have to spell it out. So there are many other applications. Certainly it has application to prisons. And you name it, preaching, teaching. Okay, questions or comments? Chris? Oh, I'm sorry, get to you in a second. Go ahead, Chris.
For those who never do get beyond level 4, authority is, authority
Yeah.
as the highest right.
Right.
Is it helpful at all to refer to God as the highest authority?
Yes it is. Yes it is. But it's always a little bit of a stretch because level 4 people aren't thinking in those terms. But nonetheless, you can partly get there by talking that way. And, you know, in the Christian church, if 2/3 of you're the preacher, you get 2/3 of your listeners don't get beyond level 4, that's probably pretty useful in that way. William?
You described the Constitution as a level 5 document written based off of level 6 principles in the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
Which outlines a government by the people, so
Right.
we all vote, but the majority of the people never progress beyond level 4.
I see a dilemma. I see at least a paradox coming here, if not a dilemma. How does this work with a constitution where most people are level 4? Yeah, very very good question.
We're encountering constitutional, like, why do we do things the way we do, and why
Right.
do we
Right.
we're kind of, as a culture, trying to grapple with like level 6, stage 6 questions.
Right.
And then we're voting on both practical applications that depend on our knowledge of that and
Right.
on higher level questions that will depend on how we apply it in the future. How does that even work?
Yeah. So how does this work? I'll tell you ideally how it works. The Declaration is level 6. By the way, these nutcases out there, the left, will argue that the Declaration of Independence is not a founding document. I just want to tell you that's how they try to weasel out of the implications. And then when they say that, by the way, I will ask them, well, where in the Declaration or where in the Constitution are people given or said to have a right to life? not given, because you can't give, rights aren't given, they're given us by God. Okay, government can't grant rights, only recognize the rights that God has given. Where in the Constitution, this is what I'll ask them, where in the Constitution does it say that we have a right to life? Where does it say we have a right to property? Okay, I want you to know, neither are in the Constitution. The only, and you don't get in the Constitution any statement of rights. Why? It's all in the Declaration. And the people that wrote the Constitution understood that the Declaration gives the principles. Now we're going to put those principles into practice by the way we structure the government. Definitely a unit. So ideally, how does this work? Ideally, legislators then take the social contract, the Constitution, recognizing that it's based on natural law, and put it into particular level 4 laws. You can't drink and drive, okay? You can't rape somebody. And I just give those as examples. Those are level 4, based on level 6, but they're level 4. Yes, go ahead,
Is
William.
that maybe why they formatted it as a representative republic rather than a straight democracy? Because instead of asking the people,
Oh my, you're getting me in trouble now. But go ahead.
asking the people to vote on particular things
Yes.
where they need a level 6 understanding, we, as originally designed, asked them to vote for individuals who hopefully have that level 6 understanding,
Yeah.
who then vote on and make those applications.
Good. Yeah, so the question is this why our founders didn't believe in direct democracy but set up a representative government? Yes, that's why. But I'm not going to say any more because I'll get in too much trouble. No, maybe I should. But, you know, I'm not involved in politics, so let me say more. Our founding fathers believed that the more I'm going to say sophisticated, that doesn't really capture it, but the more sophisticated statesmen, I'm going to say the Cicero type of people, who was a Roman statesman, who I quote frequently because he understood this as a non-Christian very well, that the sophisticated statesman who understood a lot of things could govern better than the masses. Okay? That's how they saw it. I'm not going to comment on whether they're right. I'm just going to say, excellent question. Jack?
I'll just comment on about that. The reality is, I think, what I've learned from you today, most voters are level 1, level 2s.
Well, no, they're mostly level 3 and 4. I'm not as pessimistic as you are. I'm close. But everybody's capable of 1 and 2. And Clay is saying, I've seen it too often that they're...
Politicians play at levels 1 and 2.
Well, one party plays level 1 and 2 more than the other. Oh man, I'm getting in more trouble. Clay is saying, end of this. At the same time, you know, the application is pretty profound. Jack, go ahead.
On the legislature, you talked about natural law being, form talks about being denied by Richard Hawkins, but either I dozed off or I didn't hear what you said, Dawkins said about natural law.
Well, what he said about the laws, he said there is no right, Richard Dawkins, there is no right, there is no wrong, all we have is DNA and we dance to it. Quote unquote. There is no right, there is no wrong, all we have is DNA and we dance through it. And if you're a materialist, that's the right answer. You've got no other options. Yes, Clay? Please.
On F3C, you say natural law contains both tables of the law. I just want to understand what you mean by that. You don't go so far as say natural law is the 10 Commandments, or is that basically what you're saying?
Well, I would say the natural law are an application of the universal principles, and in that case, they include the 10 Commandments. But let me clarify that by saying that the Code of Hammurabi has many of these same principles, and they too are applications of the Universal Code Level 6. Now, are they as good as the 10 Commandments? No, they are not. But the structure is the same, that they are applications. And that doesn't mean that they're unimportant, because Level 6 doesn't mean much until you apply it. But again, look at how Luther explains the commandments. He explains them consistently in level 6 terminology. So Luther understood clearly that these are applications of the universal, of the love your neighbor as yourself. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. He understood that clearly.
The Ten Commandments are an application of the natural law.
Well, they're part of it, yeah. That's a good way to put it. I would say they're an application of the universal principles that are contained in natural law. Mm-hmm. But like I mentioned, Clay, for me, the breakthrough was understanding that the content of the Ten Commandments and everything in the moral code and the scriptures, the content is the same as the content of natural law. What's written in our heart is the same as what is written in Genesis, Exodus, and so on. Now, what's written in our heart doesn't have the detail, but the basic content is the same. Now, let me make another application at that point because I think this is so interesting. I ask my seminary students, what are the 2 basic principles of preaching? Immediately, knee-jerk reaction, right one, preach both law and gospel. And I'm going to go off on a side, okay, what's the second? They don't know the second. I say the second basic principle of preaching is preach the text. Oh, but of course. Okay, that should be knee-jerk. Nonetheless, all preaching should include law and gospel. But then following the paradigm that we've studied here, I also point out to the seminary students, said, look at Peter's Pentecost sermon, look at Paul before Agrippa, look at Paul on Mars Hill, and you will find that precious little time is spent to preaching the moral law. A very small amount. In Peter's Pentecost sermon, it's way less than 10%, maybe 5-ish, something like that. Why? Well, I'm going to speculate here, but I think I'm connecting the dots. People already know the moral code in their heart. You want to activate it. You want to make contact with it. You want to bring it to the awareness of your listener. But the listener already knows the moral code in his heart. He doesn't know the message of Jesus the Christ. And so preaching focuses on the cross and his resurrection. And I think that's one of the most important applications. Mission work focuses on the cross and the resurrection. Now, there can be exceptions. You know, you get some kook who says morality is self-chosen. I mean, there can be exceptions where you might have to spend more time. But as a general rule, spend your time on the message of Christ. That's one of the most important applications of what we've looked at here. I know you're all hearing things here that you've never heard before. I understand that. Well, you've probably heard bits and pieces, or you've seen bits and pieces. You know, I understand that. But I will say, you know, just understanding this is going to open the door to seeing the applications again and again and again and again. And you're going to find yourself sitting across the table from a beautiful young lady who says, yes, but what would people think? And you're going to be right with me. You're going to think, Kohlberg level 3. Don't tell people it's dangerous for them to talk to me, but I assure you it is. Mark.
Is it a correct understanding that prior to the Ten Commandments, all that godly people had was moral law?
They had it already. That's right. Well, prior to the Ten Commandments, we probably don't know what specifics they had. I'm sure there were some, but we don't have any record of it. And they may well have been social contract, particulars, or it may have been, that in the nomadic culture, the Abrahams of the world just said, okay, here are the rules. And would they be applications of level 6? Knowing Abraham, they would be. So I suspect they were there in some form, but the Ten Commandments is the first written record we have in the Scriptures of the universal principles being put down, in detail. By the way, there are many other details given in Leviticus besides the Ten Commandments. And they aren't all in the moral law category, but many of them are. Or are based on the universal principles. A bull goes wild and kills somebody. What's the penalty? a bull goes wild and kills somebody, again, same bull, same owner, at some point, the penalty changes a lot based on the universal moral principles of love your neighbor as yourself. How do you justify divorce? On the civil law, how do you justify divorce? Well, you'd rather have people divorced than have somebody kill somebody else. Is that perfect? No. But I mean, theoretically, it's based on, you know, the universal principles. Drunk driving, how do you justify that? Laws against drugs. I'm going to think here maybe one more question, Clay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Yes, sir.
If moral law is written on our hearts, are we to assume then that in individuals that haven't attained level 6 or are capable of it, but it's been retarded at some point?
Excellent question. Population, most people are at level 4. Are they capable of going up to level 5 and 6? Let me first tell you what Kohlberg says. He says that when you teach you teach people like we've done here, he said people will prefer a level 1 stage ahead, typically, will prefer a level 1 stage ahead of where they have been operating or where they have been thinking, and they will change. They will switch up 1 stage. He says that's about as far as you can go. So I'm just quoting Kohlberg. That's what he concluded. But I want you to know he also says that students in private schools on average are 1/2 stage above students in public schools. And that shouldn't be surprising because the private school is doing a better job of teaching morality. Public schools teach morality too. Okay, I mean, you can't run a school without it. But private schools do a better job. And it would be interesting to do a study of homeschool kids because I wouldn't be surprised if on average they're a full stage above. But let me just give an application to of that and then we're done. Kohlberg says that in education there are all these dunderheads that think they aren't teaching morality, all right? And I'm being kind to the language that's being used. So he gives the example of Miss Peach. And this is the parable, but he says this is, no, he says this is similar to what he's observed, because he would go and observe classrooms. Miss Peach comes into class with a class of 5th graders and says, I want you to know that the rules of the class are what you want them to be, and that's where we start. So on the second day, there is a kid in the back of the room that is screaming, Johnny, what's wrong? Blake hit me. Blake says, Johnny spit on me first. Okay, what's Miss Peach going to do? What's Miss Peach going to do? She says to Blake, Blake, it's not polite to spit on people. And Kohlberg says, I don't think that's any improvement over the 10 Commandments, but it is a moral principle to say it's not polite to spit on people. So then she had the class, with her guidance, put together a list of 10 rules. And he says they were no improvement over the original 10. But he gives that as evidence. You can't run a school without a moral code, and in this case, it was an inferior one. But it was enough to allow them to run the school. I thank you for allowing me the chance to be with you and enjoy this fellowship. And when Clay asked me if I could come, I couldn't say yes fast enough because, again, I said this is my reason for living, to bring this information to as many people as I can. So thank you. God's blessing on your continued work with your men's fellowship.
With the group here, do you want to mention if they would like to have you at their church or other organization, what's the best way to get in touch with you? My email is probably the easiest, aquist@blc.edu. I'm part of the Bethany College system. And by the way, if you go to the Bethany College website, all the profs are listed, and you can just direct message me. Bethany Lutheran College, probably the easiest way. Okay.